Good evening. The Sutton Historical Society welcomes everybody. As always, thank you to the Congregational Church for letting us use the building here. Charlie is kind of new to our group, 2 years now. 3 years, yeah. So she brought up this little introduction. I'm resisting glasses, so bear with me. Before Charlie had children, she was a librarian in York and London, England, with a master's degree in liberal information management. Librarians help people find information, and she just can't help herself sharing the fascinating things she discovers. She does a lot of that at the museum. As a longtime homeschooling mom, she moved to the United States in the winter of 2022 with her family and Sutton later that year, choosing her new home primarily based on recommendations of a friend who used to hang out in her garage when she was a high schooler here, a girl from Sutton, Susie. She is about to undertake her next step in her career, working towards chartered genealogist status. So if anyone has a family tree brick walls, she would love to hear from you. She volunteers as an assistant curator and newsletter editor for the Sutton Historical Society and loves historical gossip above all. But Ed's from Worcester, and he's a metal detecting fellow that works with us. And Ed always said how lucky in Sutton we are to have not only the history that we have, but to be able to have the written history. And he finds something, and he goes to history books and matches it to a potential story. And such as like Charlie's doing, all the information she's finding next door in our little museum. So she's been a big asset to the group. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
After Charlie's done, we're going to do questions, and I will be handing the microphone to you. So
in the UK, November 11th is Remembrance Day. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, the First World War hostilities ended. And this armistice was commemorated each year, and it grew into a remembrance of all those who died in the line of duty. In the United States, the same day was renamed in 1954 as Veterans Day, and it honors all of those who've served, rather than only those who have passed. But both days, they teach us how to remember the lives of those who fought for our freedom and rights today. And I believe we remember the past best by retelling the stories of the past. So that's what my presentation is about today. Once upon a time, there was an English woman who traveled across the seas to the United States of America. She found herself in a small town in Massachusetts with a small amount of free time and a desire to do something useful. So she emailed the local historical society. And here I am. Tonight, I'm going to tell you some stories from Sutton, focusing on the time of the Revolutionary War. Some you will have heard, some will be new to you, and some will be a little bit different to your version, and that's okay because stories can change over time. These stories are all based on real documents that I discovered while researching our Revolutionary War soldier project, as we commemorate the events leading up to the Declaration of Independence in 1776 and beyond. I hope that these stories will inspire you to find and tell your own, and if you'd like to share with me any of your own stories, then there'll be time to do that after the presentation. So the Englishwoman first visited this room in the spring of 2023. She did not run away screaming at the sight of hundreds of boxes and piles of things, and she was lucky enough to be allowed to volunteer and work in this room full of wonders. She began with a lot of help, thank you Joyce, and thank you others, to sort through the piles, putting things that were known in one box and those which were new in another. This process, which she called tidying the museum, was a lot of fun, and I highly recommend it to anyone who wants to avoid tidying their own house under the guise of volunteering for the community. It doesn't look like this anymore, by the way. You can see a lot more of the floor in that room. While she was tidying, she came across all sorts of wonders: diaries and letters and ledgers and photographs and newspapers and objects, and each one can tell us something about its owner and bring the past to life. In her spare time, the Englishwoman started to read the town history to learn a little bit more about her new home. It's a weighty tome. I'm currently using it as a mouse mat. In this book, she discovered a list of all the Sutton men who had served in the Revolutionary War. She didn't know much about the war, and it should say that this talk is not going to include a lot of details about the bigger events of the Revolutionary War. That's not what my thing is. But this slide should be entitled, "It Seemed Like a Good Idea at the Time." This is a couple of hundred names. The page on the right is the Minutemen, who marched on the alarm of April 19, 1775, at the very start of the conflict. As I read, I noticed that there were 3 names missing. I don't like gaps. I'm a librarian. I like information. And this piqued my interest. So, I looked up the original muster list of the militia. And this is where I have to insert my first thank yous of the evening. To Family Search, which has diligently digitized and made accessible billions of records like this. To the Massachusetts State Archives, who generously allowed me to use many of the images that feature in this presentation, and to Keith Downer, who put me in touch with Joel Bowie, who gave us an amazing presentation about the bullets fired in the first days of the Revolutionary War. He helped me find these records. So these are the men that appeared on the previous screen. 100 or so men who marched from Sutton as Minutemen on April 19th. Now, the joy of digital records is that you can zoom in, so I did, and I discovered the 3 names I was missing. So we can now change Sutton's story, and we can add the names of these men to our official town history. We have John Cowes, we have John Melody, and we have David Sibley. But I also noticed something else on this list. David Prince appears in the town history. I'm sorry, that isn't coming up as quite as highlighted as I'd like, but you can just about see him in the bottom section. But he doesn't appear on the muster roll. But David Prince Chase does. So you might be able to see where this is going with my love of information and everything being right, and why the previous slide had its title. Now, in my spare time, and I'm saying that a lot, so I actually have some, I proofread romance novels for one of my friends. And I don't like editing mistakes in books, so I felt obliged to start checking all the names. I then discovered that in the town history there are only 2 companies of Minutemen listed as marching on April 19th. Sutton actually had 4. There were nearly 150 men who marched out of Sutton on April the 19th, 1775. Companies led by Captains John Putnam, Andrew Elliott, Arthur Daggett, and John Sibley, who led a team marching with a cannon. And as an aside, it took years to get a replacement for that cannon. Years. There were letters going backwards and forwards to the government. We'd like our cannon back, please. Can we have a replacement for our cannon? And when they eventually sent us a cannon, the town treasurer records are full of things to fix the cannon. They clearly didn't send us a good cannon. So years and years after that, they're buying lumber, they're taking labour, they're buying iron, they're trying to fix and paint this new cannon that they've been sent. It's a whole thing. But anyway, we'll probably never know if the town history compilers missed the records, or they were just pushed for space, or it's an editing error. But this tiny correction led to what I'm now calling the Revolutionary War Soldier Biography Project. Finding and researching all the soldiers who were from Sutton and fought during the war. Now bear in mind, on that list we have a couple of hundred names already. My spreadsheet's now at 502. So that's 502 men who were born, lived, married, or are otherwise connected to Sutton in some way. And I think we need to take a moment to appreciate what an impressive number that is, not for my project, but for Sutton. To highlight that, this is a list of all the male inhabitants of Sutton in February 1778. Now, you were excluded from the draft, such as it was, if you fit certain categories. If you were over 70, if you were a person of colour, if you had a disability, or if you were a graduate from Harvard College. The number at the bottom is the total number of men who were eligible to serve. That's 568 men. So in 1778, 568 men were eligible to serve, but over the duration of the war, we sent over 500 men, which is pretty incredible. In fact, our part of Massachusetts supplied so many men that people were not very happy about it. And this is not to diminish the patriotism of our town, but imagine the suffering that Sutton families must have felt when so many of our young, fit husbands and brothers and fathers were away, particularly in a farming community. And around the time of the accounting in the previous slide, Colonel Jonathan Holman wrote from Sutton that the officers of the militia of this regiment judge that we are called upon and have done more than our proportion with the other regiments in the brigade. For when we suppose that we were nothing behind any regiment in the state in December 1776, were called upon to go to Providence, and actually went upwards of 300, most of which continued in service there 6 weeks, which was so much more than any regiment had done. So that's one of the main reasons why I thought this was an amazing project to take on, because clearly Sutton made a massive, significant impact on the forces in the early days of the conflict. Also, Jonathan Holman's secretary had amazing handwriting. Considering what a lot of these documents are like, I really like this guy, whoever it is. It's not Jonathan Holman, because the handwriting's different for the signature, but it's lovely. I love it. So, the spreadsheet and the documents give you a sense of the bigger picture. Large numbers of soldiers left Sutton to fight for their freedom. Many returned, some did not. But what I want to discover is the people behind the numbers, their stories, their lives, and their legacy. So I chose to do this by creating short biographies of each of the men on the list. This is the first volume, detailing the lives of the Minutemen who marched on April 19th in Captain Andrew Elliott's company. It's currently a rough draft, but it will definitely be on our website soon, and by saying that, I'm definitely going to finish it. I didn't do it alone. I had a lot of help from volunteers, and the brief that I gave them was to outline the soldiers' family, their birth, their death, their service, and then to find one interesting tidbit of information that makes them come back to life. That could be a pension record, a deed, an inventory, a letter, a house, a gravestone, or as here, a signature. Even if we can say nothing else about our patriots, we can say that these men and women were actually there when these documents were signed. And I think that's pretty special. So in the rest of the presentation, I'm going to share some of the stories that I've come across on my own journey through the records as we've been working on this project. First, we must talk about the soldiers of Sutton. That's where this all began. The National Archives holds all the extant Revolutionary War pension files. From 1818 onwards, men who'd served in the Revolutionary War could claim a pension based on their service, and their widows could claim later on, and sometimes their children. These files are a goldmine of juicy gossip and fabulous stories. They include accounts of the conflict that go far beyond the usual troop movements, and eyewitness accounts of the small things that affected these men so greatly that over 40 years later they could still remember all the details. And these are just 3 examples of things that I found. James Fletcher wrote, "At Watertown he saw 2 dead men who were killed, as was said, by the British on their retreat to Boston." Now this has nothing to do with the length of his service, this has nothing to do with his pension application, but it brings into sharp relief the realities of war, even at such an early stage. This was probably the first time that young man had ever seen a dead body. Jonathan Gould, as portrayed by our own Jonathan Anderson at the Oh My God event, he says, "We were engaged in building the fortifications on Dorchester Heights just before the British troops vacated Boston." Now his service record just reads, company marched from Sutton, Douglas and Northbridge, December 9th, 1775. So without this pension file, we might never know that he was actually there helping to enact Rufus Putnam's audacious fortification plan. And finally, in Seth Farrow's pension application, we have a supporting statement from a fellow soldier that relates, "I was told by William Davenport, then a neighbour to each of us, that he delivered a large loaf of bread called a peck loaf to said Farrow at Roxbury, then a soldier stationed there." Now this is important. It's a really tiny action of something that happened in everyday life during the Revolutionary War. But the important thing is that William Davenport did not claim a pension. So we don't have any detailed record of his service, but we know where he was because he's mentioned in somebody else's pension record. Which is why when I talk about, at the end of this presentation, about the transcription project to do with these pensions, I hope you will all consider the importance of it and consider joining in. And finally, the graphic here is from the National Archives. It shows you some of the things that you can find in pensions. I can add to this list at least 3 men from Sutton who claim to have cut George Washington's hair. He clearly had a very great hairstyle for most of the time. So let me tell you about the Walker family of Sutton and show you the kind of stories you're going to find if you do start investigating Revolutionary War soldiers. Asa Walker Sr. married Abigail Hayden in Hopkinton in 1748 and the two moved to Sutton. They lived on what we now call Wheelock Road. They had 12 children. When the revolution broke out, 3 of those sons, Elisha, Asa Jr. and John, were the first to answer the call. They marched on April 19th in Captain Arthur Daggett's company. You can imagine this mother standing at her doorway, watching her sons march off to parts unknown. She knew that there was fighting. She didn't know if they were going to return. They were gone for a week and 4 days, but that must have seemed like an eternity. Over the next decade, more of her sons would take up arms. Gideon, Leonard, Pearlie, and Timothy. 7 sons in all, each serving in some capacity. But not all came home unscathed. John died in 1780. His cause of death is unrecorded. It might have been camp disease, which was a catch-all term for dysentery, typhus, and fevers that was prevalent in the Revolutionary War times. In fact, some sources say that the camp disease killed more people than the bullets did. It was brought back to Sutton by the soldiers, and we'll find many examples of camp disease listing in death records of that time. Joshua, their little brother, died of camp disease. After the war, the family scattered. Elisha went west to Blandford in Hampden County, accompanied by his cousin Joel Hayden. Abigail, Elisha's sister, also made her way there. Oops, I didn't mean to hit that. Marrying James Mann. They announced their intention to wed in May 1782, but they delayed the ceremony until July after tragedy struck. Asa Sr. died just 5 days after that announcement. Gideon and Leonard both went north to New Hampshire, though to different corners of it. Gideon, whose service is described here, became a blacksmith in Croydon, and his grave still survives there, but it's not nearly as well tended as the ones that are in Sutton. Leonard, meanwhile, ended up in Lisbon and later applied for a pension, claiming extreme poverty. In 1821, he listed his entire worldly possessions. A few articles of kitchen furniture, mostly old, not worth more than $5, and a pig, worth $1. Imagine you're serving your country and putting yourself in danger for so long, and this is how you end up. It's very sad. Pearlie, who was described in his service record as being 5'2", with a light complexion, went to Vermont. I'm slowly getting the hang of this microphone, by the way, can you tell? Please shout me if I'm not doing very well. So he went up to Vermont. He was still alive in 1850, but like his brother, he was in the poorhouse. Life had not been kind to Pearlie. The Walker daughters fared a little bit better. Mary married and moved to Western Massachusetts, and Elizabeth married into the Stockwell family and settled in Millbury. Only 2 of the sons stayed in Sutton, Asa Jr. and Timothy. Asa Jr. remained on the old family farm at 40 Wheelock Road, where he lived with his wife, his children, and his widowed mother. When he died in 1809, he left a substantial estate and made sure his mother was also provided for in his will. Timothy was a carpenter who lived on Winwood Road. He was appointed guardian to Asa's 4 daughters, Hannah, Mary, Julia, and Satira, and was given over $7,500 in Asa's will in trust for them, which is a pretty significant amount of money for 1809. Abigail Hayden Walker lived on, outliving at least 4 of her 12 children. She eventually remarried, but she outlived her second husband, William Phipps, as well. Now, the town history makes mention of Abigail in the history of Wheelock Road. And here is an example of how we start trying to tell a story, and we end with another story to be told. Because in the town history, it reads, "She believed in witches, and her boys imposed upon her by wonderful feats in the black arts." Now surely that's another story to be told. So many people left Sutton during the Revolutionary War. Some didn't return. I have soldiers on my spreadsheet dying as far as Louisiana and Indiana and Maine. But plenty of people came to Sutton as well, both to live and just passing through. As I was researching for our recent Waters Farm Day event, I wanted some photographs of the interesting properties I've seen. I've seen this building many times, and though I've never been inside, I looked it up in the town history. Now, if you've ever done this, you will know that the meandering Homes of Sutton section is a little bit tricky to navigate. But I persisted, and after a lot of research, I'm pretty sure this is the right building, rather than the nearby West Sutton Hotel or its predecessors. This building is well described in the town history, but what interested me was this story. It reads, "In the days of the Revolution, a train of powder wagons accompanied by a military escort on its way from Philadelphia to Boston passed this house. One of White's boys, full of mischief, stuck pitch pine slivers into an apple, and as the train passed, lighted his torch and threw it at the last powder cart." Now this act obviously enraged the guard, and a pursuit ensued. Windows were smashed, threats were made, and the boy hid under a local mill flume. Eventually the guard made their way up the hill to the tavern, and Mr. LeBaron persuaded them that they were good Union people, and this was only the foolish act of the mischievous boy. Now that's quite a story. I'm not a historian, but I did want to find out if there were any original documents that might add information to this tale, and I discovered something rather interesting. Most of you will have heard of Henry Knox's noble train of artillery, which brought the firepower to Boston from Ticonderoga in the early months of 1776. Now this did not go through Sutton, it more or less followed the line of the Mass Pike. But after the British evacuated Boston, Knox was ordered to attempt the same feat, bringing the artillery to Norwich, Connecticut, and then over to New York, which was the new theatre of war. We can just imagine Washington full of admiration for this young man who achieved such a miraculous feat, overcoming the terrible weather, the awful roads, and marching straight towards battle with determination. But it didn't go quite so well this time. This was a slightly less noble train of artillery. We know from orders given that 2 convoys were made, one with the guns and one with the rest, and they were all sent from Cambridge to Framingham, to Sutton, to Dudley, then down through Connecticut to Norwich. But there were not quite as many willing volunteers this time, and the order was given to press into service teams from each town. This is a letter from Robert Cook in Grafton. He writes on April 9th, 1776. "The 3 fresh teams I got then are already tired, and say that they cannot go any further than Sutton, which is 6 miles from here to there, and I expect to find them all tomorrow morning, and all of them wanting to have their teams shifted." Imagine the people of Sutton, along Boston Road, watching as disgruntled, tired, and hungry teams of oxen, pulling carts full of gunpowder and ammunition, trek southwards. I hope they cheered them on. So I'm going to stop talking about soldiers now, as I would like you to read our book when it is published. I could talk all day about the men who served, and as you can see, there's a lot to find out. But I'd like to turn now to the people on the list who were not eligible to serve. The women and the children who stayed behind when their husbands, fathers and brothers went off to fight. Life went on. There were bills to pay. There were jobs to do. These are 3 snippets from our own town records. They are treasurer records, and they show how the business of war was absorbed into the general business of the town. Willis Hall received £2, 3 shillings on behalf of the Committee of Correspondence for numbering the inhabitants of this town and for a quire of paper brought to him to make a committee book. That will have been for making a list of people like the one that we saw earlier in the talk. Widow Ruth Woodbury, who is actually the mother of our treasurer, received 7 shillings silver money for 1 pair of stockings for the army. There are lots of entries like this. Men and women weaving, knitting, or otherwise donating items to be sent off for the good of the servicemen. And even in wartime, Sutton had to look after its poor. Caleb Chase was paid £1 and 5 shillings and 4 for a cow for the town for the benefit of Widow Kenny. I'm not sure which Widow Kenny this was, or if she had to share the cow with the town, but that's another story to investigate. Now, much of Sutton's Revolutionary War would have been dull, which as a civilian is exactly what you want. I had 4 grandparents who all lived through World War II in England, and they could tell you that the boring days were the best days. But occasionally there was excitement. Now, this is a story that appeared in the Massachusetts Spy in September 1779. I can't show you the newspaper clipping. I discovered last week that the American Antiquarian Society, who holds this newspaper, only has permission to print the digital version of their clippings on t-shirts and hats. They can't give permission to use it in presentations. And I didn't have time, it wouldn't have gone with the outfit to put a clipping on here. But I can read some of it for you. This is from the Massachusetts Spy, which is Isaiah Thomas's newspaper, and I love some of the stories in this. On Sabbath day evening, the 19th of September 1779, part of the Committee of Safety and Inspection for the town of Sutton received information that a number of wagons belonging to some of the inhabitants, loaded with salt, rum, sugar, and other articles from Boston, were designed to be pushed out of town under the cover of the silent night into a neighbouring state, contrary to the spirit and intention of all the acts of the General Assembly for the prevention of monopoly, and the ruinous commerce of a number who, to advance their own interest, would sacrifice the honour, liberty, and life of the community, and contrary to the resolutions of the state, and country conventions, and the votes and resolves of a late town meeting. The short notice and the dexterity of the owners and the carriers of the before-mentioned goods to effect their purpose was such that only part of the committee, with a few of those respectable inhabitants, could get together to stop the intended enterprise. However, these waited until the noise of the carriages and drivers proclaimed their approach. When the committee went forward to meet this commercial body, they drove on Jehu-like, intending by bold faces, hard speeches, and the resolution they could muster to carry their plan into execution. But, to their disappointment, upon advancing a little further, they found a few men, though not so blustering and noisy, yet from just principles and a hearty attachment to the general interest, who instantly set bounds to their proceeding, implying that so far as they might go, no further. The before-mentioned loading was stored, and the next day a number of other teams with contraband goods were stopped and the goods secured, and a general town meeting was called. Information is received that 20 loads of goods have been stopped in the different parts of Sutton, including one which had 1,600 pounds of tea, which is an incredible enterprise. The town meeting was then reported in the newspaper article, and the owners of the before-mentioned loads of goods were required to give a perfect list of all and every article, on penalty of being reported as enemies to the general cause and having their names inserted in the public papers. Now, I haven't found their names in the public papers, so I am assuming that they repented. Now, in the previous story, there was a mention of the committees. and one of their jobs was procurement for the war effort. And here we have a letter signed by a man who doesn't appear in my list of soldiers, as he didn't serve in the militia or army during the war, but he nevertheless played a vital role in serving his community and country and earned his place on my spreadsheet. This letter is signed by Malachi Marble, and in 1777, in the winter, he was contracted to go and buy beef and pork for the army. So he set out with his friends, Jonas Brown and Benjamin Garfield from Grafton, to Hartford. His route took him west through the frozen mud and snow to Hartford and the Connecticut river towns, where he hoped to buy livestock for the Massachusetts supply. However, the governor in Massachusetts refused his request, explaining that all provisions had been demanded to be kept within the state. So, did he give up? No. He turned north. He got on a boat and he went all the way up the Connecticut River to Northampton, stopping along the way to try and buy cows, pigs, beef and pork. He got as far as Northampton, where at last he found cattle for sale. But the price was 3 pence, 3 farthings per pound, which was extortionate. It was far more than he expected, but he paid it because he had no choice. He had a quota to fill. But pork was another matter. Everywhere he went, the answer was the same. All the pork had been bought up and bespoke for. The war had swallowed every hog in the countryside. There were a few scattering ones that could be found, but never enough. So this is him writing to Boston with his colleagues, essentially saying, unless the board considers his case, he's supplying the army, but he's going to suffer financial loss. The prices were rising than the contracts allowed. Every day they delayed, our brave adventurer loses another shilling. Now, men like Malachi Marble are never going to see the glory of the battlefield in the Revolutionary War, but without them, no soldier would have eaten and no campaign could have been fought. Now, a lot of these documents that I've been showing you, I found online. But this is our town records. They are in our town hall, safely stored in the vault there. And I'm including this because I was asked a while back if Sutton had a particular document. Now we don't, alas, or rather not that I can find. It might still be in a box in the room that I showed you at the beginning. But we do have the copy that was required by law to be taken down. And I think it's a little bit blurry, but if I zoom in, and anybody reckon, you might be able to read the date at the top of the document. So this is the declaration by the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled. This declaration was printed and sent out to all the Massachusetts towns. Isaiah Thomas, as I've mentioned before, he read it aloud in Worcester, and in Sutton, Benjamin Morse, our town clerk, copied it word for word in the records. Or rather, almost word for word. This is a document that I'm assuming that most people in this room are very familiar with. But Sutton's copy has a few slight differences. There's a tiny story in this very familiar document. As I was photographing this, by chance I noticed something odd, and I checked, and indeed, in the original printed copy that Benjamin was supposed to be copying faithfully, there are no capital letters and exclamation points in this section. So now, we are changing the story. Instead of a town clerk just diligently copying things down, we have a man impassioned. We have a man putting in exclamation points. At every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. That's why I like these original documents. Because you could just read the words printed in a book and never know that Benjamin Morse had this passion for what he was writing down at the time. But this document clearly shows it. Now, I'm often asked what I know about the American War of Independence. And to be honest, not a lot, beyond what I've learned in the last 3 years. We lost, so they don't teach it in British schools, and they don't really talk about it over there. But I do think as historians we have the duty to tell the stories of both sides in a conflict. The 1770s were not a time of black and white views. There were arguments raging in taverns and meeting houses. There were debates. Friends and neighbours disagreed on the best course of action and what would be best for their future. The road to independence was definitely not wide and straight. Nathaniel Gowing was one of those who disagreed with the course that the war was taking, and he suffered the consequences of aligning himself with the losing side. This letter, which is in the collections of the American Antiquarian Society, is an accusation and conviction of Nathaniel from 1776. It reads that the said Nathaniel did some time before, in some expressions, respecting a difference between Timothy Payne, Esquire, and Joseph Miller, both of Worcester, aspersed the character of the said Miller. Now, Timothy Payne and Joseph Miller were both important men in Worcester at the time. Timothy Payne was town clerk, but he was also a loyalist. And shortly after this judgment was passed, he fled to Nova Scotia, never to return. It also says, and further, that the said Nathaniel did fraudulently stuff sundry quarters of lamb, which he exposed to sale with the readings of the guts. In the times of shortages and rising prices, selling bad lamb was considered on a par to espousing unpopular political views. The committee concluded, we discover an zealous regard for the friends of government, which was another term for a loyalist, so-called, and a disesteem of that cause for which we contend and bleed, which are strong words indeed. Fortunately for Mr. Gowing, punishment for loyalists was not lashings or imprisonment, but was to be called out in front of his friends and neighbours at a town meeting. In 1777, Lieutenant Samuel Daggett was appointed to procure a list of all of those people who have inimical dispositions towards this or the United States. In the same month, Nathaniel appeared in front of a judge after failing to show up to the militia. He didn't contest the accusation of disloyalty and he was fined £10. However, in November 1777, a Sutton town meeting voted to strike the name of Nathaniel Gowing out of the list of inimical persons to the American cause, so perhaps he had reformed his views. He eventually enlisted in the Continental Army for 3 years in 1781, after which most of his family left Massachusetts for Vermont and did not return. Now, as assistant curator and newsletter editor, I sometimes receive inquiries redirected from our website. One such inquiry was from Ed Brumby, who was asking the society if the society knew anything about 3 Scottish soldiers from the 71st Fraser Highland Regiment, who had been sent from Worcester Jail to Sutton during the war, after their ships were captured in Boston Harbour in 1776. Now, I Google a lot, and so I thought, I have never heard of this, I will find out. And indeed, hundreds and thousands of Scottish soldiers were captured. Their ships were captured in Boston Harbour, and they were imprisoned. Several groups of prisoners were lodged in Sutton during the Revolutionary War. There were men captured on Long Island, there were these Highlanders, and later there were men captured at the taking of General Burgoyne. But the Highlanders were a real problem, because they were initially sent to lots of different jails in Massachusetts. But jails in those days were not massive prisons. They were small affairs, and they didn't have the room to cope with a large influx of prisoners. So any men that were well behaved were sent out to local towns to lodge with the families there and to earn their keep by labouring on the farms. Some of them escaped and went on the run. Some of them died, but the 3 men sent to Sutton had a rather different story. Archibald Todd was born in Glasgow, in Scotland, in 1757. He was the son of John Todd, a printer, and his wife, Elizabeth McQueen. He sailed for New England in the spring of 1776, aged about 19, and he found himself captured along with hundreds of his compatriots. He, William Duncan, and Angus MacLeod were sent to Sutton. They were lodged with local men, Lieutenant Joseph Elliot, Lieutenant Richard Bartlett, and Mr. Jacob Snow. But later that year, the powers that be decided to recall all of the prisoners to Ipswich Jail, which is about 80 miles away. Then this letter appears. This is the Committee of Correspondence, which we've heard about before. They took the unusual step of writing to the General Assembly to ask for the Scotsman back, please. Duncan, MacLeod and Todd have worked in said Sutton and have behaved themselves very well and sober by all the time they were with us. And they, the said Duncan, MacLeod and Todd, being very desirous of abiding with us, as also with the several persons with whom they heretofore did labour. We therefore humble petitioners, humbly pray that your honours would be so good as to give orders that the above named Duncan, MacLeod and Todd be again liberated and have leave to return to Sutton to live with and be under the care of Lieutenant Joseph Elliot, Lieutenant Richard Bartlett and Mr. Jacob Snow, the persons with whom they have formerly lived. So back Archibald, Duncan and Angus came to work among their American friends. Angus, I believe, moved to Western Massachusetts, although I haven't finished researching him. Duncan fell in love with a local lass, Sarah Day, married her in Sutton in 1779. They moved to Oxford, and William petitioned the General Assembly for leave to remain in the country, which was granted. He died before 1801, leaving a will with an inventory totalling over $1,100. 25 years earlier, he arrived in America with the clothes on his back as a prisoner and an enemy of the state. And he was successful enough in this part of the world, it gave him the chance to become what was essentially a wealthy man. I think that's pretty incredible. Archibald took a step further, not only settling in his new home, but fighting for it. He enlisted in the Continental Army for 3 years, serving in various capacities. We can see in his service record that he was credited to the town of Sutton, but reported as belonging to Scotland. He also found love in his new home. He married Loney Titus in Mansfield. They had 3 children, and the family remained well established there for many years. Their graves are in the Happy Hollow Cemetery in Mansfield, and I wonder how many people in Mansfield know about the history of their soldier. They might know that he applied for a pension, so they might know that he was a Revolutionary War soldier. But how many of them know that Sutton was vital in playing a part in this man's life? So we're at the end of the presentation, or the first part of the presentation. And I wonder if any of the stories here have inspired you to find out your own. I should say that I wanted to leave time for questions, and I struggled to narrow down this presentation. So I didn't tell you about Dorcas Delano, Matthew Mallet and Margaret Fosdick, who were evacuees from Charlestown who ended up in Sutton. I didn't tell you about Asa Waters' slightly unsuccessful powder mill and more successful armoury that helped to create the town we know as Millbury. I didn't tell you about Townsend, Vermont, Dixfield, Maine or Marietta, Ohio, which were towns settled by the men who left Sutton. Or Andrew Sigourney, Jonathan Robinson and Gideon Hanscom, men who were employed by the town or by individuals as substitutes, serving in the war for other men who were unable or unwilling. Or Silas Goodale, Abigail Morse, Mary Taylor, Mary Chase, Mary Case, Abigail Bucknam and Betsy Boyce, widows living as the head of their own households in 1790 after the war, in a time when women don't really feature in records. Or the witness houses. How many buildings in Sutton built before 1775 are still standing, visible witnesses to a time before independence? Or Ichabod Odell, Richard Demon, John Hector and Solomon Jennings, men of colour, often forgotten in town histories, but they're remembered in this project as patriots. Or William Batchelor and Francis Dudley, who instead of marching on April 19, 1775, they joined the Quakers, and they were confined in a loathsome prison in Worcester for refusing to fight. Or the Confessions of Fornication, which I decided not to talk about this evening, but you can find them if you look on them online. There's quite a lot of them, and they're very funny. Or the preachers and diarists who give different perspectives to how Sutton thought and worked in the 1700s. Or the long story that I alluded to of the town's quest to get their cannon back. Now, I think that the telling of stories from the past is one of the best ways to keep history alive and to bring it to life for the next generation. And I'm certain that many of you do have stories to tell. So before we finish, I'd like to tell you a couple of ways that you can help the society and your community. The National Archives and the Blackstone Valley National Heritage Corridor is running an initiative to transcribe all the pension records. You saw tiny clips of them. If you could read even one word in that handwriting, I suggest you give it a go. The handwriting is not as bad as you think it might be. Sutton has 93 soldiers with pensions. That is a significant number, and only 1 or 2 of them have been transcribed. It's a lot of fun, and the handwriting is not that terrible once you get used to it. So if you would like to come along to our workshop, then make sure you are receiving our communications, or keep an eye out on our website. You could also write a newsletter article if anybody would like. I'd like to put out a new version of the newsletter. So editing and writing help is always available. If you have a story that you want to tell, we can help you tell it. Or you could join our Revolutionary War Soldier Biography project. I've got 46 down and 456 to go. Finally, I owe so many thank yous for this presentation. So thank you to all of these people and groups.
Lights? The lights back there?
Any questions? Oh, yes. Sorry, Brian.
I'd like to compliment you and the Sutton Historical Society. This is a nice prelude for the PBS series, which is coming up next week, Ken Burns' series on the Revolutionary War.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it.
And one of the comments that he had in an article in the Boston Globe this Sunday, in the Globe magazine, was that the small stories are very important. And I think that your project here goes to prove that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions? My husband told me to put this on the screen. So there's a big thing with Apple, where Steve Jobs used to give the big press conference every year. And he used to go through the whole press conference and not announce the big thing that was coming. So my husband said I should put this quotation up here, because in the grand tradition of rock bands everywhere, I have another story for you. Once upon a time, there was a woman who found herself in a strange land. With time on her hands, she offered to help with a task she dubbed tidying the museum. The curator of the museum had determined that a new exhibition was required, and so the cabinets were to be emptied and cleaned. The woman, super keen and enjoying the peace and quiet of the museum, decided to put her knowledge of folding expensive ladies' clothing to good use. That's another story, I'm not telling that story tonight. And she offered to pack up a few artifacts to make sure they stayed safe for the future. One, in particular, piqued her interest. She spread this item out on a table, with a bedsheet underneath to protect it, and smoothed it down. Now, this woman's knowledge of New England towns at this history, and towns and history at this point, was largely confined to Little Women and the Gilmore Girls. So she didn't think that this item was anything particularly special. As far as she knew, each home had something similar in their attic. However, her spidey senses started tingling, and being a librarian by training, she thought she'd better do a little Googling just for her own interest. "Oh gosh," she said. I'm being filmed, so, "Oh gosh," she said, or words to that effect, as Googling did not produce the result that this item was cool but commonplace. Instead, it appeared that there were very few of these items, and most were in private hands, and when the words, "We're not even sure if the Smithsonian has one," appeared in an article, she phoned her colleague, and the ball was set rolling on an adventure. This is not the item. In 1912, the General Rufus Putnam chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution was founded, in the very building that houses our museum. This artifact is unfortunately needed very expensive repair, but you can still read the names of the women who formed the first membership. The DAR did many things, one of which was to build a museum collection, which was displayed in the General Rufus Putnam Hall. In 1986, the DAR voted to give the entire collection, apart from the card tables, to the Sutton Historical Society. And many of the items do indeed have a label indicating that they were once part of the DAR collection. And as far as I know, we didn't keep the card tables, so I think we're good. But back to the story. This item was a flag with rather too few stars on it. This newspaper article, probably from the Milbury Journal in 1959, is also in our collections. It reads, Mrs. C. Theodore Johnson, Regent, and Mrs. Walter Shaw, shown with the historic flag which was given to the General Rufus Putnam Chapter DAR by Mrs. Christian Breel of Sutton. This flag has been handed down from generation to generation in her family. It was carried in the American Revolution by Mrs. Breel's great-grandfather, Major Josiah Woodward, who lived at that time in the small house on Milbury Old Common, now occupied by his great-great-grandson Carl and his wife. Mrs. Breel remembers hearing her grandfather speak of watching from the house while his father and others practiced drilling on the common. Now the Englishwoman sucked her teeth and squinted. She was an experienced genealogist and needed to check this story before pursuing this whole flag thing further. Josiah Woodward did not serve in the Revolutionary War. He was too young. He was a major in the militia, but not until 1807. However, his brother Jacob and his uncle Samuel did serve. Mrs. Breel's grandfather could feasibly have seen his father drilling on the common, as it was known to be a training ground. So there are clearly nuggets of truth in this story. The house that he lived in was probably standing in 1775. The family lived in Sutton continuously until the 1950s, and family memory can be a powerful thing. Becoming convinced, after a few phone calls, Joyce, Christine and I took a trip to upstate New York. There, we met a fabulous woman called Rabbit Goody. Now, Rabbit owns Thistle Hill Weavers, where she weaves cloth for the Star Wars TV shows, and the Emily Dickinson house, which I'm a weaver and a spinner, so this was super exciting for me. She's also a renowned textile historian. Basically, if there's an old flag out there, her name is probably associated with researching or authenticating it. She spent a very long time looking at our flag. We counted picks and ends under a hand lens, we measured stars and stripes throughout. We discussed fabric differences, applique techniques and handmade eyelets. And more importantly, we went for really good lunch. It was a really good lunch. And then she took us home and she gave us cheese that she had made in her house that she had built. It was a really awesome day. Rabbit concluded that this is indeed a pre-1800 13-star flag. It's in the 454 configuration, which is how the stars are arranged. That makes it pretty early. The first official flag design was noted in 1777, so we're theoretically looking at about the 15 years after that date. It's made of wool bunting, hand-woven and hand-stitched. And interestingly, I just discovered that all the wool bunting for these flags was woven by women and children in Stowmarket in Suffolk in England, which is where my family is from. So this could have been woven by one of my ancestors. I think that's really cool. Each star is cotton with linen stitching, and the stars are double-sided. So a lot of stars have a white star on one side, and then the blue is cut out on the back. Ours doesn't have that. It has two stars back to back. So it looks the same back and front. The canton, which is the blue section, is also pieced. You can just about see the seams on there, suggesting that it was perhaps made by more than one person. It certainly wasn't manufactured in a factory. This is something that was made by hand by people. Some things we're never going to know about this flag, but we know a lot now. There are lots of little repairs. You can see one there, that's an early repair. And Rabbit had no doubt that this thing was flown. This is not just a decorative item. It's big. It's 4 foot by 8 foot, or thereabouts. And it's a maritime flag. So it may have been used in training manoeuvres on the Old Common in Milbury, but its origins were definitely by the sea. This flew on a ship, or this flew on a fort. It's in incredibly good condition. I've done a lot of looking at 13-star flags over the past few months. This one is in much better condition than any of the other ones that I've seen. But I could talk about it for a long time, but I kept on wondering, how on earth did a ship flag get to Sutton? We're not known for our sailors. In fact, I had soldiers and sailors on an early slide, but on my spreadsheet there are no sailors at all. Could it have come from one of Josiah's neighbours on the Old Common? James Freeland, who was a renowned Revolutionary War surgeon, or Ebenezer Chaplin, pastor of the North Parish of Sutton. Or perhaps Josiah was put in charge of the flag for the local militia when he was made major in 1807. He was promoted to replace Paul Whiting of Northbridge, who in turn replaced Caleb Burbank when he was promoted to Brigadier General, and those are names of notable men in the area, so they could have got hold of the flag. A little bit more left field. The town history remarks that among other notables, John Paul Jones, and when you Google him, you do also get the bassist from Led Zeppelin, so you have to choose which one you want to research, visited Lazarus LeBaron's tavern. He was alive at the right time to have brought a flag with him, and he's known to have flown a 13-star flag on his ship. I thought this was entirely conjecture, or just one of those anecdotes that people tell. But, at Oh My God, our metal detectorist, Ed Krostowski, showed me this. This is a button that he dug up behind where the current LeBaron Tavern building is. The building that would have stood in the Revolutionary War is not there. I don't know if you can see closely there, but that's one of those buttons. Now this is a naval button, and this is a naval button that would have only been worn by commissioned officers. And if you look really closely, those are the buttons that John Paul Jones is wearing in that picture. So suddenly the idea that a commissioned officer from the Navy was in Sutton is entirely feasible. There's also a link to this gentleman. This is Commodore Abraham Whipple. Solomon Sibley, who was from Sutton, married his granddaughter. And he definitely knew General Rufus Putnam because the two of them worked together to go and found the town of Marietta in Ohio. Commodore Whipple was the first who raised the US flag in British waters. And this is a painting from 1786. If I zoom in, there's our flag, flying on a ship, on a painting painted in 1786. So, regardless of how it got here, and I will find out eventually, I am like a dog with a bone with this thing. We used a generous donation from Unibank to have the flag cleaned by Museum Textile Services. They recently worked on preserving the Massachusetts State House flags, so they have very carefully cleaned it and rolled it for us. Eventually, we'd like to get it framed so that everyone can see and enjoy it, but right now we don't have anywhere safe enough or climate controlled enough to have what would essentially be a frame which would be 5 foot by 9 foot on the wall. For today, I'm going to have to trust you not to touch it and just to enjoy its beauty. So, not in a rush, but if anybody in the room would like to come closer to a Revolutionary War era flag than most people in the United States ever have, you are now welcome.